is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists at Paderborn University. And today I'll be discussing Emily du Châtelet's views on hypotheses with Ruth Hagengruber, who is professor of philosophy at Paderborn University and the director of the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists. Just a brief word about who du Châtelet was. She lived in the 18th century. She was a physicist and chemist, as well as a philosopher. She published various scientific works in journals, but also translated Newton's Principia into French and published a major work on philosophy, the Institution de Physique. So, Ruth, you've done a fair amount of work recently on du Châtelet's views on hypotheses. Can you first introduce the historical debate on hypotheses that was going on at the time that she was writing?
Thank you, Aaron, for having me here and for discussing the hypothesis in Emily du Châtelet. So I thought about hypothesis in Emily du Châtelet for quite a long time. I published on the hypothesis in 2011, and now I took up this topic once again because I think it is a crucial topic in Emily du Châtelet. And of course, and so it is so crucial because it was the topic of the time to define science and to understand the problem of science in that time. And because I think that she succeeded to present a new theory of hypothesis that allowed her to get a new start in epistemology, etc. So what was the situation in that time? The situation was that there was a kind of confrontation between the, as Voltaire said, the continentals and the islanders. This is how Voltaire, companion of du Châtelet, took that. And what was that? Du Châtelet said, this was a divide. And the divide, in what consisted it of? The point is that it was a core question of the science of then, and it was a core question to decide on astronomy. Why? Descartes had a certain idea on hypothesis that was based on principles. Descartes is seen as a rationalist, that is, he is looking to give an explanation about the movement of the planets according to certain principles. His principles are mechanism principles. He has the idea that there are some vortices, and these vortices move. There are thinner and thicker ones, and they lead the planets to get the shape they have and to keep them, however, in a mechanical movement, touching to a certain extent also each other. For Newton and the Newtonians, this is going much too far. They say this is crazy to take hypothesis to such a far point and to claim things like a plenum when we don't see the things between the planets. So we see planets moving, but we don't see a plenum or something which is between the planets. So the Newtonians and Newton himself said, no, we don't do hypotheses. Hypotheses are the poison of philosophy, they say. We do observation. And when we observe the planets, we see the planets are moving, but there is nothing in between them. There is a vacuum. And so this is a situation. So it is not only about hypothesis, the crisis in science at that time. It is the crisis about how do we explain the movement, it's a question of ontology, what is the first cause of these movements, and so on. It goes rather far, the difference. And this difference is said by Emily du Châtelet, it is the divide in philosophy of that time, and it is, as I see that, the motivation for her to write her own book, to overcome that divide. And I think she succeeded in doing so.
So du Châtelet then is confronting this debate between two sides, the Cartesians and the Newtonians. Would you say that she just agrees with one side or the other, or does she try to find some other path for her own view on hypotheses?
This is very interesting because she's keeping on to hypothesis. So it seems as if she was on that side, but she develops on the basis of hypothesis a completely new approach to philosophy of science. So she does not agree with Descartes, and she does not agree to leave hypothesis and not to use hypothesis. She says also the Newtonian, though they said they wouldn't do, they are doing hypothesis because science isn't possible if you don't do that. So what she is criticizing with Descartes, and what does she criticize in the Newtonians? The Cartesians, she says, and she develops that very clearly in her first chapter on principles. And I think some people are reading this chapter, differently than I do, because this chapter on principles, she clarifies that principles of our understanding lead us, of course, to understand anything. But we must understand that principles, what we can unlock with principles, is only a part. We often take principles much too far. And this is what she's criticizing in Descartes. She says Descartes has tried to bring the principles to the first cause, but we can't access a first cause. That's about. He is taking principles much too far, and he is taking hypotheses and making hypotheses and bringing them to fables and to reveries, making fables and reveries, because he's following principles like in the Euclidean tradition and deducing, and trying to find the one Archimedean point from where he can deduce then the truth of the world. But she says this is not how the world and our knowledge is made. On the contrary, we are always in the middle of something. We never get to the end. We can't reach and we cannot access causes. And this is a very crucial change that she's starting now, because in doing so, somehow the whole old ontology of the rationalists is breaking down. And as we see, also the ontology which is behind the observationalists, or let's say the Newtonians and the empiricists, is also breaking down. Because how does she criticize the denial of hypothesis in the Newtonian? She says, the Newtonians, or this empiricist school, they think one observation, yes, this could be the real world, let's say. But then they are falling into an inductive fallacy. She's very modern in that sense. They are taking a particular observation for being the whole thing. And this is wrong. This is simply wrong. In doing so, taking one observation for taking it for all, is an hypothesis itself already. Mm-hmm. And this shows that both parties are using hypothesis wrongly. And she is then showing us how one has to use hypothesis, and secondly, that we need hypothesis. And she will change the idea of science while doing so.
All right, so you've said that du Châtelet doesn't quite agree with either side in this previous debate. Can you tell us a bit more about her own positive views? How does she kind of intervene in this debate and forge a new position?
As I've already mentioned, I think that stating this divide in philosophy was the motivation for her to write the Institution Physique. And I keep to saying and to talk about the institution and not the foundation of science as it is translated often, because I think there is a good reason to hold that the methodology she is following, she is taking from the juridical methodology. So each of the chapters that she's writing in that book is structured in a way that seems also to refer to this debate of the divide. So there are always different parties who hold different views. How should we tackle that problem? Who is right? This is what is at stake when she's trying now to get into the hypothesis. Who is right, the Cartesians or the Newtonians, and how can we prove what is right? So her juridical method it is really like, let's say, keeping justice to something where you have never seen the cause of. This is, you have to judge on what is right, but you can't trace back the facts that you have in front of you because you haven't been present there. And I think she makes the analogy between the two things that in law you can't say the one holds the one and the other holds the other. So we will see if their arguments are consistent. And I think this idea of consistency is what she's bringing now into epistemology. At the end, we will see, and I'm advancing here too much, but she is changing questions of ontology. She's no longer talking about causes. She says we can't access causes. And she, in the next chapter, even holds we can't access reality. We must understand that we are always in our own perception of the world. We do not access real reality, and we are trying to make us a picture, scientific picture of what there really is. And so we have to examine the views about how the real world is. And it is this examination that she's presenting here in her chapter on hypotheses, and that has to be developed. So many things are connected to that, and many views that she holds on her own, because she says we have limited knowledge. So when we want to know, we have to start and to be aware of this limited knowledge, and then we have to control this limited knowledge, because we see the mistakes that can follow from that, referring then to the Cartesian taking principles too far and starting to speak about the whole world, but only starting with one observation. So these are two crucial mistakes that we must solve, this methodological problem that has to be solved. So what was the question now? Please, once again.
Well, just to continue to say a bit more about her, de Châtelet's positive views on hypotheses, and maybe you could specifically address an example of a hypothesis that she considers good or better than some of the competing alternatives, given that a hypothesis is sort of something where we don't have conclusive evidence, we have good evidence, and so it's a bit up for grabs exactly which hypothesis to choose.
It is very interesting because although she's keeping to hypotheses, indeed what she introduces in that chapter is something which is really crucial now. It is the imaginary notion. And this is also why the concept that Châtelet has created in philosophy is so completely new. But I would like to go back now and to explain the imaginary notion to make it understandable. So she says, she brings the example with Ptolemy and Copernicus. And she says, look, Ptolemy and Copernicus, they both started, and we all can see what is happening. When we look into the stars and the planets, it looks as if the sun is turning around the earth. So, the observation is the same for us all. Nonetheless, Copernicus has drawn a completely different conclusion out of that. And this is interesting. This is important for her to show that we have the same observations, and therefore we can see that an observation is not enough for drawing conclusions. So Ptolemy has drawn the conclusion he has drawn, and it turned out that the conclusion from this observation were not sufficient really to explain follow-up observations and so forth. So she says, what did Copernicus? Copernicus, in front of the same observation, but he simply drew the opposite hypothesis, she says. So hypotheses are something that comes to your mind and say, let's try this one, this interpretation. So she is putting into the room now a completely new idea of how we get insight in scientific insight. The point is now that the use of principles and the use of observations become now the control instances for these imaginary notions and for these ideas. So indeed, we could have many, many ideas about the world. You can have, she says, sometimes you are also falling into fables and reveries, as Descartes did, when you don't use then as a securing moment for these hypotheses to control if your hypothesis, the hypothesis you have taken, if it is really, if it can be verified and made consistent with other truth-like insights by principles and other observations. So she is creating now a system, an epistemological system that goes for consistency and for probability. And she goodbyes the former way of doing philosophy, searching for the causes and so on. Because in most of the cases, she says, we never get to that causes.
So you've now shown us how du Châtelet develops a novel approach to hypotheses that doesn't just depend on particular observations, but also doesn't just descend from first principles. Now let's turn a bit to her legacy. How would you say she was influential later on, both in the 18th century and even later towards our own time?
So firstly, I would like to repeat once again what is the new insight she had. Because this is what makes then her legacy, at least when we come to Kant. So she says we do not access reality. She says that we cannot go back to the final causes. And she says that science is an expanding discipline. That is not, science is not to understand this is here and this is there, but it's an expanding discipline that is scientific knowledge is created that we have. I think this is really important to understand that. Then du Châtelet was a very famous person in the 18th century. She was among the most outstanding and well-known scholar in the time. This is true for her Parisian surrounding, where Clairaut is among her friends, the Bernoullis are among her friends, Maupertuis has been among her friends, and also the new and coming people like Buffon and Diderot, they all are in her Helvetius, they all are around her. And one must also remember that her book was immediately translated into the Italian and into German. So it had a huge influence in these countries. And from there on, so speaking about her influence to the Berlin Academy. Think of Frederick. She had a correspondence with Frederick the Great, the second, who was starting to build his academy with most of the friends of her and the correspondence of her, like Maupertuis, like Euler. And so we see her work there in the work of them. It impacted them. But one very famous figure in Germany was surely impacted the most by her and even wrote his first dissertation on her ideas on the so-called vis viva. It is Kant. We know and we understand today that several great ideas, if we speak about space and how we construe reality that we cannot access, if we talk about the turn of perspective with Copernicus, there are several things where we find more than analogies in the thought between them. And it is even Eberhard, the great opponent of Kant, who comes back to the Châtelet when he says, "Oh, your ideas are not so new, my dear." And so there was this huge influence in Germany, but there was also a high impact given that her friends, Diderot and d'Alembert, and also Lametrie, I don't want to forget about him, although we can't talk about him right here. So they took huge parts of her book into the encyclopedia. So from this encyclopedia, huge parts of her book, like on space, like on hypotheses, was spread all over Europe, of course. And sometimes she was mentioned and sometimes she was not. And this is what we find. Let's say Glenn Rowe showed how many parts of her book are in the encyclopedia and so on. And this goes further to the 19th, to the 20th century, as has been shown by Gianni Paganini and Véronique Leroux. They show that they compare to the findings of the 19th century and also to Bachelard and Poincaré and Popper. And yes, it is important that we understand how this Saturnian impact went till our days. And in 2006, when Einstein, so when in the Einstein year, was it 2006? I don't remember, but there are books written that compare the idea of time and of space and of the dynamics that Einstein is working with and refer even to Châtelet at that time. So her impact is huge and we are only starting now to get into that. And I'm very grateful also for your work, Aaron, here at the center and reconstructing the manuscript from the first draft that she has developed from 1737 on up to the 1742, then final and second edition. Perhaps you would like to add something on the development, how you would judge that.
No.
Okay.
So that concludes today's interview. And if you'd like to learn more about Du Châtelet's views on hypotheses, you can check out, among other things, a book that Ruth co-edited called Époque Emilienne with Springer that discusses both hypotheses and many other aspects of Du Châtelet's science and philosophy. And in the future, you can look forward to a forthcoming edited volume that Ruth and I are doing together that will discuss Du Châtelet and Kant based on a conference that we had here earlier this year. So we're really looking forward to that and hope you will check it out at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron.